Hello photographers, today I'm going to share with you the best metering mode to use in any shooting situation. But before we get started, if you're into photography and you want to learn how to use your camera to take amazing photos, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below. Now, I get this question all of the time. What is the best metering mode for portraits or landscape or sports or weddings or whatever the case might be? And I'm going to answer that question. But before we get started, very briefly, you need to understand how the camera meter works. The camera meter is the camera's brain. And what it does is it reads the brightness values in the scene, how much light is in the scene that you are about to photograph. And then it evaluates that to determine the exposure. Now, I cover this in great depth in this playlist right here. So if you want to check that out, go through here after this video. But if you want to know the best metering mode for shooting in any situation, I personally think that's spot metering mode. Briefly, what spot metering mode does is looks at a single point in the scene. It's usually about 3% and it's usually aligned with the central focus point on your camera. And the reason I prefer spot metering mode is because it is very predictable and it gives you control. The other metering modes, to some degree or another, look at the entire scene and try to balance out the entire scene. I almost never want that because I want to know exactly what the camera is going to meter for, and that's why I prefer spot. Because when you put that spot on your subject, whether it's a person or a flower or a tree line in a landscape or a lake or a bird or something else like that, the camera is going to meter for that subject and that subject only. And when it does that, I know, generally speaking, what I'm going to get from the photo because I understand how my camera works and how the camera meter works. The problem with the other metering modes, in my opinion, is that there's too much unpredictability because you don't actually know how these modes work. The evaluative or matrix metering modes are proprietary, mathematical, algorithmic programs that run in your camera and slice up and dice up a scene into different parts and look at the different parts of the scene and try to figure out what you think is the subject and what it should expose for. But if you choose spot metering, you are telling the camera precisely what the subject is and what you want the camera to expose for. And that goes for any situation. However, many people want to know what's the best metering mode for different scenarios. And I'm going to tell you the best metering mode for 8 very common shooting situations and why you might choose that metering mode over spot or whatever other metering mode there is. Now, for landscapes, even though I do use spot, if you want like the best metering mode for landscapes, I would say it's actually the evaluative or the matrix metering mode. Because generally speaking, when you're shooting a landscape or any sort of scene, a cityscape, any kind of big, wide open scene that you're shooting, you want a good exposure for the entirety of that scene. And that's where the evaluative or the matrix metering mode can be helpful because it will look at the entire scene and it will try to average or balance out the exposure for that entire scene. Now, for street photography, you might want to lean towards spot if when you shoot street photography, you tend to shoot portraits of people, whereas if you tend to shoot the street scene, you would probably want to use the evaluative / matrix metering mode or the center weighted average. Center weighted average is nice because it gives priority to whatever is in the center of the frame. Maybe that's a person, maybe that's a particular feature of the street scene you want to highlight, but it still considers the rest of the scene. For sports photography, hands down, no question you should use spot metering. Generally speaking, when you're shooting sports photography, you're trying to capture the action. You're trying to capture a player or some players doing whatever the thing is that they're doing in the sport. And you want them to be exposed well. You don't really care about the scene behind them because you want the action. And if you use spot metering and you put the spot on the player, whether it's on their head or on their jersey or something else like that, then you're going to get a good exposure for the action you're trying to capture. And the same thing goes for concert photography. You should absolutely 100% use spot metering for concert photography. In concert photography, you have all those crazy lights all shining from different directions, and those lights can very easily blind and confuse your camera when it comes to exposure, which might mean that the performer you are trying to capture is very overexposed or very underexposed. But if you use spot metering, when you put the spot, again, on your subject, on the performer you're trying to capture, the camera is going to ignore all of that other light in the scene and make sure that your subject is properly exposed. Now, portraits, you could actually go either or. I generally recommend spot metering for portraits because you are shooting a person and you want the person to be well exposed. And that would mean that you want to ignore the rest of the scene around them. So for most portraits, I would say use spot. But if you tend to shoot a lot of natural light, and if you tend to shoot environmental portraits where you're putting people in a big open scene and the scene is as important as the person you are shooting, then you may want to use center weighted so that you can give the subject priority in that exposure while balancing out the rest of the scene, or the evaluative / matrix metering, which will again try to balance the entirety of the scene, in theory including your subject. For group portraits, I would also recommend either spot or center weighted, not evaluative / matrix metering. Spot, because if you put the spot on one person in the group, then generally speaking, the entirety of the group should be well exposed, presuming that you're working in pretty even light for the group. However, you could go with center weighted average metering because that's going to give you a bigger spot, which is going to cover more of the group. And if you are working in a little bit uneven lighting, then that averaging of the group of people, or however many people are covered by the center of the frame, which can vary from 10 to 15% depending upon your camera, you'll get a bit more of an even reading and exposure across the group. For outdoor portraits, again, it kind of depends. If you are very much focusing on the person, then you should definitely use spot metering. But like I said earlier, if you're shooting an environmental type portrait where you want the entire scene, then you might want to use center weighted or the evaluative / matrix. I would lean towards center weighted because again, the subject is going to get priority in the evaluation of the exposure. And then finally, night photography. Night photography is no different from day photography in the camera metering situation. Yes, it's different in terms of the lighting that you're shooting in, but you still have to think about how the meter works and what your subject is. So if you're shooting night photography and you're shooting landscapes or other big scenes, then again, like I said earlier, you'd use the evaluative or the matrix. But if you're shooting some sort of a portrait, or if you're shooting, again, sports or a concert, all of those things, like I said before, are going to be spot metering or whatever I said earlier. So basically, when it comes to night photography, just put night in front of the type of thing that you're shooting on this list that I just went through, and that will tell you what metering mode I would recommend. But of course, as I said earlier, I use spot metering for everything. I never change my metering mode, and I prefer spot in any and all situations because of the control I get and the predictability, because I know what my subject is, and I know when I point my camera at my subject, it's going to meter for my subject and my subject only. So that's what I recommend as the best metering mode for any situation. Now again, if you want to learn a whole lot more about metering modes, you should check out this playlist of videos right here. And I do have a free metering mode cheat sheet. Link is down in the description if you want to grab that. If you have any questions about metering mode, let me know down in the comments. And I've got a question for you. What is your primary type of photography? What is the thing you shoot the most? And what metering mode do you use for that currently, and why? Let me know down in the comments. Now, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. And when you do, make sure you hit that bell icon so you don't miss a single one of my videos. And then make sure you get out there and take some damn photos. I'll see you on the next one. I need some chapstick. Are you an addict? I am. Oh, God. I feel so good.